Welcome back to HuffPost Live. I'm Alona Minkowski. Now, one student was left dead today in the hands of a shooter at Reynolds High School in Troutdale, Oregon, right outside of Portland. Here's a police press conference after the situation was contained.
A gunman entered the high school this morning, shot one student. Unfortunately, that student has died. The gunman was located, and the gunman is also deceased.
Are there any more injuries besides the student who was shot?
My understanding, they're still investigating the school. They're still going through the school. My understanding that is it. Its initial indications are that is it. But we're still working the investigation.
Now, as the Huffington Post reported today, it is the 74th school shooting since the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in December of 2012. According to data from Everytown for Gun Safety, a group fighting to end gun violence, a school shooting has happened 1.37 times for each school week. And these incidents have happened across the country, with 31 states having had an incident of gun violence happen at school. But with a school shooting happening every week, people continue to ask what more needs to be done. On Twitter today, New York City Councilman Mark Levine wrote, "Today's machine gun attack at a high school in Oregon is the 74th school shooting since Newtown. What will it take for us to finally stand up to the NRA?" And the BBC's Katie Kay writes, "With every school shooting, our response, emotional and professional, diminishes. There seem to be so many." Now, there are some more details on the case of Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl that are emerging. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois revealed today that the Obama administration only finalized the prisoner swap for the 5 Taliban detainees a day before it actually happened. And he said that American officials didn't even know many details of the swap while heading into it. He told reporters today, quote, "They knew a day ahead of time that the transfer was going to take place. They knew an hour ahead of time where it was going to take place." But many lawmakers are still angry about the swap and the lack of information on it. Here's House Speaker John Boehner this morning.
This idea that they couldn't trust us to not leak things is just not true. And it wasn't just me. There were other members of the leadership who were well aware of the planning and the activities that were going in to this effort.
Now, Durbin has pushed back on Republican lawmakers and the public who are against the prisoner swap. He says that as people learn more about Bergdahl's imprisonment, it will, quote, help explain why the president considered this such a threat. Now, after months of court hearings and deliberation, one group of Occupy Wall Street protesters has finally found victory. On Tuesday, the city of New York agreed to pay a settlement of almost $600,000 for wrongfully arresting a group of demonstrators during the Occupy movement on New Year's Day of 2012. Now, the settlement is the largest of its kind in New York City since Occupy-related events began making their way to the courts. And the movement, which took off in September of 2011, spoke out against economic and social inequality in America, a system that allows for the 1% of the population to have more power than the 99. Now, during Occupy, police were highly criticized for their excessive use of force and strong-arm tactics with protesters. So when 14 activists were arrested in New York City after failing to leave an area the police instructed them to, but also prevented them from leaving, the group took their case to the courts and argued that they were taken into custody for expressing their views. Now, today, that group of individuals managed to get the justice that they were seeking. Joining me now to tell us about today's decision is Jennifer Pete, an Occupy Wall Street activist and one of the 14 plaintiffs in the case, and her attorney, Wiley Steklow. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us in.
Now, before we get into what happened today, Jennifer, let's go back to what happened on that day in 2012 on January 1st. And so we have some video, too. So we can go back to see what happened on New Year's Day. You and other demonstrators were marching in Manhattan when this started to happen.
Block the sidewalk and then warn the protesters they were blocking the sidewalk.
Where can I You can disperse by yourself now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You've been allowed to you again. Hold on. You just said we can. That officer just gave me an order that I am free to leave. And that gentleman just put his hands on me and threw me back here.
Excuse me, officer. They've actually blocked off the entire side.
That way you can exit that way.
Now, after that went on for a while, New York City policemen then decided it was time to start arresting people.
This man is now being arrested.
What are you being arrested? on the wall. Let's go.
Jennifer, walk us through exactly what happened to you that night.
So that night, friends and I went to Zuccotti Park to celebrate our accomplishments for the year. We were proud of the movement that we had been a part of. And after midnight, we left the park and we started marching, just continuing to celebrate. And early that morning, we were stopped by the officers, as you can see in the video, and we're essentially detained. They told us they had enough, time to stop, and we were arrested unlawfully.
And then how long were you in custody for?
About 5 hours.
And while you were in custody, while you were being arrested, you tried to talk to the police officers, you know, ask them, why is it that you were arresting me? What did I do wrong? Why am I being treated like a criminal?
Absolutely. I'm a union organizer. I've been an activist for a long time, and you know, it's pretty common that people protest, speak up, get together when they have something to say. We were being lawful. We were on the sidewalk. We were marching. We were moving. When I asked, you know, why am I being detained? Why are you holding me? We didn't get a lot of answers. They seemed to be frustrated. There seemed to be some confusion. And then when they told us to disperse, there was nowhere for us to go. And so it was a little chaotic, as you can see in the video, but really frustrating as well.
And so, you know, it's not every day, too, that that people can sue the police and win. You know, but originally going into it, how is it that you and these 13 other individuals decided to get together and say, we're going to pursue this in court?
I knew from the beginning that we were falsely arrested. I knew that it was fairly ridiculous. I was really angry about it. We were given tickets to appear in court. When we came to appear in court, they declined to prosecute any of us. And it was at that time that we really started talking together as a group. And it was at that time that I met Wiley.
So Wiley, tell us a little bit more about this case too. You know, what did the judge say? Were they on the occupier side?
Well, the judges didn't have a lot of opportunity to weigh in on this case since it settled before it went to trial. It settled through what's called a Rule 68 offer from the City of New York. They make an offer of judgment to each plaintiff, and once that's accepted, then they negotiate the attorney fees with the lawyers involved. So that's how this thing settled. The case is, I think, extremely interesting because you have 14 protesters who decide to stand up for their rights against the people who are violating the rights, the people who are supposed to support them and exercising their expressive speech rights, their constitutional rights, and here we see that didn't happen. The police just decided, for no real reason, they wanted this to end and they were going to now arrest people, and they did it in a way with what you call the white shirts. If you watch the video, you see white shirt officers, and this indicates senior NYPD officers. So you would imagine these are the people who know the law the best, and they're there to try and help make sure that the underling police officers are doing everything correctly. But these are the ones who sort of gathered on the corner of 13th and 2nd, stopped everybody, made sure that they couldn't continue walking, and then said they're blocking the sidewalk and then wouldn't give them a path to exit. So there's sort of two unconstitutional things happening here. One is an unlawful order to disperse. They were not blocking the sidewalk. The police did not have the right to tell them to disperse at that time. The second one was once they made that order to disperse, they didn't give the plaintiffs, the occupiers, the chance to comply. They didn't give them a path of egress, and they didn't give them time to exit. So those are two unconstitutional issues, unconstitutional orders that came out in that moment, and it made our case somewhat easy to prove once we got the depositions done.
And what was the attitude of the city the entire time while you were pursuing this, though? You know, this is not the first Occupy-related settlement that we have seen, although it is the largest one in New York City at this point. But are they, you know, did you see this as admitting fault on the part? Because if you go back to, you know, Mayor Bloomberg and his administration, for the most part, they were very defensive about the actions that they took, and it was not an apologetic tone.
Clearly there's a difference in the administration that we have in the city of New York now, and my hope is that the settlement of this case, coming on the heels of the settlement of other big civil rights cases, the RNC case recently settled, the stop and frisk case settled, the FDNY discrimination suit settled. These are big settlements coming on the first few months of this administration. It's a hopeful indication to a civil rights lawyer like myself that this administration views the rights guaranteed under the Constitution differently than the last administration did. We've been under a Bloomberg-Kelly administration for far too long, and I'm very hopeful that activists such as Ms. Pete and others of my clients will be able to participate in expressive speech activities without having to risk false arrest.
Now, Jennifer, despite the fact that this settlement is a whopping 600 grand or almost 600 grand, you yourself get some 20,000 out of this, right? But what are you going to do with that money? You know, for you, is this about the money or is it about something else?
No, it was never about the money. As Wiley said, this was really about there's consequences for actions and there's consequences for those in power and the New York Police Department when they violate citizens' rights. And so I'm excited, we're all excited, all of us in this suit, just to, you know, have made our point and to prove that there are consequences. Aside from that, too, you said that, you know, back on that day on New Year's of January 2012, you and your friends had gotten together to celebrate certain victories. You know, at the time, certainly there was a lot of momentum and everybody nationwide was paying attention to the Occupy movement. New encampments were popping up all across the country. And unfortunately, we saw a lot of clashes with police all across the country, too. But, you know, then we saw that kind of rhetoric about inequality even make its way into the last presidential election. But a lot of people think the Occupy ultimately failed, that it died. What's your take? Do you think the Occupy is something that still resonates, that can be revived? I think it does. I think it definitely still resonates. Income inequality hasn't gone away. Lack of quality health care, that's still an issue. Affordable housing, jobs, all of these issues are still there. And I think that those of us that were gathered together at Occupy, it was sort of us coming together to voice our discontent, to voice our disappointment with what's happening, you know, in our country, and to sort of brainstorm and talk about how can we change what's happening? How can we change that discourse? How can we work towards making society better? And I think it resonates throughout. I don't think that Occupy is dead. I don't think that it's over. I think these issues haven't been resolved, and I feel like both in the public and politically, we're talking about them a lot more, which I think was a goal for all of us.
I think that's the point people should take away from the Occupy movement, is that there's now a public conversation going on around the world about economic inequality. And that was not happening prior to October of 2011.
And Wiley, finally, one more thing too. You know, here you had 14 plaintiffs. In this case, you mentioned some other larger cases since Mayor de Blasio did take power here in the city. But overall, do you think that the situation is getting any better for individuals maybe who were wrongly arrested? I mean, it's still kind of a rarity.
I'd say it's a starting point, and it's too early to tell if things are getting better. I think there needs to be a retraining in the NYPD, as you can see in this video, and many other litigations we've litigated. We depose many officers, both the high-ranking ones, deputy inspectors, lieutenants, as well as just the sergeants and as well as the POs, the regular ranking police officers. And we see regularly they don't seem to understand the distinction between disorderly conduct and not disorderly conduct, how expressive speech activities and what's called time, place, and manner restrictions play into that. And they need to understand that if they're going to go out and use it as a sort of hammer to arrest people when they're legally, constitutionally, and lawfully participating in what we call expressive speech activity.
All right. I have to leave it there, but Wiley and Jennifer, thank you both for joining me today.
Great. Thanks so much for having us.
All right, guys, stick around. Much more coming up on HuffPost Live.